Christian McCaffrey and Justin Fields went crazy in week 4. Who's up for week 5? Football Guys DFS show has all your cash and GPP plays for this week's main slate. And we're going to start off with Devin because Devin has never going to cheap quarterbacks again after the DTR experience last week. And I know that you were heavy on Justin Fields in the show. Changing news on Sunday kind of led you in that direction. But what games are you looking for this week coming up?
Yeah, my kids aren't getting Christmas presents thanks to Kevin Stefanski and Dorian Thompson-Robinson. That one hurt a lot, and I think the whole world knew it because I was complaining on Twitter or X. So this week we're looking at a couple of different things. There's no value this week, like none.
Yeah.
And so you have to sort of decide, like, are we just paying down for these cheap wide receivers on DraftKings? How are we approaching FanDuel? Like, there's a lot to decide here because it's a weird week in that, like, I can't remember a week that had such little value.
Yeah, the bye weeks are interesting this week because it does seem like it really knocked out a good chunk of what we would like to play with, and the injuries as well. Phil, what games are you targeting?
Yep. So I've got the same thing as Devin in my notes about the value not being immediately apparent, but the games that I'm targeting include the Detroit side of Detroit, Carolina. In particular, I like the running backs for Detroit. I like the Giants at Dolphins and the high total there, certainly the Miami side at least. And there's at least one value play on the Giants that I'm sure we'll get to later. The Rams and the Eagles look like a game with a 50-plus point total. I think I'll be stacking that one up. And then Kansas City at Minnesota's got the highest total on the slate. That one seems like the spot where a lot of roster percentages are going to gravitate. And then my upset over of the week, which is 0-1 so far since I started it last week, is Cincinnati at Arizona. I like that game to shoot out, even though it doesn't have a very high total.
And I'm sorry, Jeff, I did not pay any attention to the question that you asked.
You're good, man. No,
I'm so focused on there being no value that, like, I completely just disregarded your question.
You're good.
I agree with everything Bill said.
Yeah, I'm at the same place too. The only other one that I would throw in would be the Jets side against the Broncos because we've seen that defense be very, very exploitable. And Zach Wilson looks like he might have had a pulse last week. So I don't know. It's a little bit scary to rely on Zach Wilson on the road, but here we are.
Because Donna Kelsey was in the stands.
Yes. Yeah, it really was. All right, before we dive in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. Feel free to comment with your questions on this week's slate. We're going to bounce into cash plays, and we're going to start out with our quarterbacks for cash plays. So, Devin, who are you looking at quarterback for cash plays this week?
Matthew Stafford, I think, is the clear-cut guy for me going up against Philly. This Philly defense, like, they were really good last year against the quarterback play, allowing like 207 passing yards per game against the position. They've been horrendous this year. 316 yards and 3 touchdowns to Mac Jones, 364 and 4 to Kirk Cousins, 290 and 1 to Sam Howell. They shut down Baker Mayfield, which I applaud them generously and wish them to continue to do that. But, like, this is a defense that they lost Avonte Maddox to IR. They lost both of their safeties to free agency. Javon Hargrave, who had 11 sacks last year, is gone. They're not the same defense. Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox are aging. They're 33 and 35. So Matthew Stafford quietly has gone under the radar. He's 5,600. He's been good. And I think they have the second most passing yards, which, like, shocked me. It might be third, but it was a number that was just crazy. And they get Cooper Kupp back this week. So at 56, you could go down to Zach Wilson at 49. But does Zach Wilson really have 300-plus yard passing upside? I don't think so. Like, I think you're hoping for 250 and 2. I'd rather pay the $700 extra because this game could shoot out. It could be 31-28, 35-31, something like that. and Stafford seems to be the clearest guy under 6K to throw for over 300 yards.
Yeah, and I think there's narrative involved as well with Cooper Kupp coming back this week, and I think the Rams and Eagles being a spotlight matchup. Phil, where are you going at quarterback? Do you have anybody else that you're looking at?
Yeah. So before Cooper Kupp was declared a full participant at practice today, I thought that it was either get all the way up to someone like Jalen Hurts, uh, mid range up to someone like Tua, or then punt it completely with a Zach Wilson or maybe even a Josh Dobbs. But I think Devin just talked me into Stafford at 700 more than Wilson. I mean, the 700 kind of matters this week, but when you compare those two situations, right? Everything that Devin just said about how much the Rams have been passing, Cooper Kupp coming back, the Eagles defense being banged up, that $700 spend is more than justified so that you don't have to ugly up your cash lineup with Zach Wilson.
Don't play sub 5K quarterbacks. Like, let's just not. Let's give it a week after Aiden O'Connell and DTR.
I agree. No,
Ruined
and you
Christmas.
took it right there. Matthew Stafford was the one that I had highlighted in my sheet as well, and I think Devin's breakdown was fantastic on the differences of that Eagles defense. We're going to bounce over to running backs. Phil, what are you looking at running backs in cash?
So first guy that jumped out at me was David Montgomery at 6,600 on DraftKings. We saw what Detroit wants to do when it's playing with a lead last week, and Montgomery saw 34 touches and scored 37 DraftKings points. I expect the Lions to be playing with a lead at home against this hapless Carolina defense, who allows the fourth most DraftKings points to enemy running backs. So he's kind of a lock button for me. And then I've got two other guys, and then one situation that I'm really struggling with that I'm going to ask you guys for help with. I really like Bijan Robinson. I think he's a little pricey for his season to date output, but he's really shown a terrific floor with 3 out of 4 games over 20 DraftKings points, and for sure we haven't seen his ceiling yet. A home favorite spot against the Texans is a pretty ripe spot to maybe hit that ceiling, and I don't see too many ways where he fails to deliver another 20-point game. The Texans are improving as a defense overall, but not so much against the run. And I think that this could be a week that CJ Stroud slows down and maybe Houston gives Atlanta some short fields to work with. And then the other guy that I have here is Joe Mixon. And depending on how things shake out, I'm either going to end up playing him instead of Robinson, or I'm going to try to squeeze him into the flex because I just want to play a lot of Bengals this week in that Arizona matchup.
CJ Stroud's never going to slow down. So just give it up. Devin, what are you looking at?
Yeah. The name that keeps popping is Breece Hall at 5,400. And we've talked about Denver, like we've beaten that horse. This is a team that over the last 3 weeks has allowed 122 yards, 350 yards, and 170 yards rushing. Realistically, Breece Hall, like they're saying he's good to go, Phil. I don't know if you're fully like into this, but like they're saying he's going to get more carries. They're saying that his role is going to increase. Whether or not that actually happens, I'd almost rather be a week early than a week late because the matchup is so good at 5,400. We talked a little bit about value, and this seems to be a spot where he very easily could have a little bit of a breaking out party. Phil, anything about Breece? Like, are you concerned?
I feel like that quote was kind of taken out of context a little bit. The Saleh thing, he said something along the lines of, he definitely said he's not on a pitch count anymore, but he also said that there's a lot of people that he wants to get touches, and it wouldn't surprise me if Dalvin Cook is another one of those people, even though he's like we should replace the term 3 yards in a cloud of dust with like New York Jets Dalvin Cook. It's the same exact thing. I can't do it in cash because I don't know that he's going to get the carries, but I do think that he is more than capable of getting there on 8 to 10, the same way that Devin Achan did against Denver. Um, whether that's kind of lucking out in cash or just knowing that Denver is that bad and Hall is that fast and they can't defend him is up for debate. I don't hate it, but he was more of a tournament play for me.
Yeah, the other name that I'll throw out there is James Conner. Conner like consistently just goes under the radar, and a lot of people are going to look at this Cincinnati defense and say they were really good against the run last year. Well, they're allowing 111 yards rushing per game. So far this year, they allowed 142, 103, and then 162 to Cleveland, Baltimore, and Tennessee. Now, that is a gauntlet of a rushing schedule. So take that for what it is. But James Conner, he's that off. He's basically that offense. Like, yeah, Josh Dobbs has been good, but you know, Connor ran for 106 against the Giants, 98 against the Cowboys, and the Cowboys have a very good defense. And he was shut down in a game that got out of hand against the 49ers. So, like, I think at his price, just pulling it up and confirming, but it is incredibly favorable at 5,800. And I think, he's a guy that can catch passes out of the backfield. So I'm trying to target guys that are under 6K. I think the Devin Achan is too expensive for cash. Alvin Kamara needs to show it another week for me. DeAndre Swift is interesting at 6K against the Rams. You could very easily stack him with Stafford, but sort of looking in that 5 to 6 rather than that 6+.
Yeah, Swift was one that I wanted to mention. I think that that's an entry point into some of these games that we talked about leading off. I like Dameon Pierce bouncing off Phil talking about Bijan Robinson. He doubled his carry. He had like 24 carries last week, and so I think that there's a shift that's happening in that backfield where he's getting more involved. And one that we haven't mentioned, Isaiah Pacheco had a great game last week against the Jets, and it really looks like he is kind of that primary back for the Chiefs playing against that Vikings in that big potential shootout game. And so that's one I like at 5,700. I think that there's some accessibility to some of these big games via the running back position this week.
So
Let's
the
bounce
one that
over
I,
to go
yeah,
ahead,
I'm
man.
sorry. Before we get to wide receivers, the one that I wanted to ask you guys about, and I heard Devin mention his name was HN because he really seems to be popping like in the optimizers, and I don't think I could do it like because I think as good as he is, he's topping out at like 10 to 12 touches. Eventually, that's not going to result in multiple touchdowns. Um, but it does seem like both Miami running backs are cheap at home with um, with a huge total and a huge point spread in their favor. I can't do the timeshare. It sounds like Devin isn't ready to. Um, Jeff, do you have any thoughts there? Is HN cash game viable?
I mean, I think he is. He's my running back 4 on ECR this week. You talk about 10 to 12 touches, but that's kind of the landscape across the league is kind of what you're looking at. You're not getting these 25 touch backs too super often anymore. And so I think that that's what he can do on those 10 to 12 touches against this Giants defense makes me feel very comfortable in terms of ceiling and probably in terms of floor too.
My issue is you're just buying you're buying the
I
high.
agree.
Like could he turn into one of the league's best running backs? Absolutely. But that is going to be bought in, or that is basically priced into the point, to the price point that he currently is at. So to me, is there a difference between him and Brees Hall? Like, not necessarily. And Brees has a better matchup, and is cheaper. So that's the only reason I don't mind Achan. I just don't want to be pissed off on Sunday when Raheem Mostert scores 2 touchdowns. Like, I would rather just wait.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
good logic.
Not
I hear that.
really. It's just my mental health stability is the reason that I'm not playing Devin Achan. Like, okay.
Well, and it goes to like to Puka Nakua is the same type of thing of like prove me wrong, and then I think that he has. But that's a good segue into wide receivers. Devin, who are you looking at for wide receivers in cash this week?
Ugly. Um, it's really ugly, and you know, I, the reason it's ugly is like the middle ground is barren. You're going to be spending all the way up or all the way down. And I the guys that I'm looking at this week, I think first and foremost, let's just start with the cheap guys and get them out of the way. Phil, Wandale Robinson, Josh Downs, Rashee Rice. Like, what are we doing here?
For me, it's Wandale Robinson by like a country mile over those other guys. I think he's got the Monday night bargain price, because salaries were released before they played, and he was up to 60% of the routes, 20% of the targets against Seattle. They mix him in running the ball every now and then. And I just like the game environment. I think it's going to be high scoring there. So when you factor all those things in, I think at 3K, he's the one that's kind of guaranteed to have the most involvement.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting from a game theory perspective because, like, people look at 3K versus 3,700 and they're like, they're all just cheap. It's a big difference in 3x between 3K and 3.7. Like, may not seem that much, but that $700 could very easily be used elsewhere. So I think I'm in alignment. I don't love it because Daniel Jones like had shades of Eli Manning where he just didn't know what he was doing on the field. And I don't know if you guys watched the game, but there was a point where he didn't even know the play call. It seemed like because he was questioning with Brian Dable, like, "Oh, I thought it was this play." Daniel Jones scares me, but he has upside, and all you need is like 4 catches for Wandale, and you're probably okay.
Mm-hmm. And I
Other
will
guys
say
I'm
that
looking. Go ahead.
that 700 is the difference between Zach Wilson and Matthew Stafford. So it absolutely matters.
Yeah, would you rather go Stafford and Wandale, or Zach Wilson and Josh Downs? Like to me, they're all the same under 4K. So just go the cheapest. Adam Thielen continues to be too cheap at 5,100. With Bryce Young, there was some concerns that he wasn't going to produce, and he had 7 for 76 last week. They need a guy that's just stable, and he's not like overly exciting, but he's a guy that's going to be certainly in the mix. And if I think about this Houston Atlanta game, it's interesting because Atlanta's secondary has been very good. Like AJ Terrell and Jeff Okuda have been playing very well. Now, whether Jeff Okuda is just a flash in the pan, we've seen 3 years of just horrendous corner play from the former number 3 overall pick. But I can't figure out this Houston receiver issue.
Mm-hmm.
I lean Nico Collins just because he's done it twice, and I think he's a better player than Tank Dell, and he's a big body receiver. I think he's 6'4", 220. So 5,600 seems to be a fair price for that passing offense. I know Jeff talked about liking Dameon Pierce. I can't get behind it just because it's 2.8 yards per carry, but he seems to be Nico Collins or Tank Dell. I prefer Collins, but I'm not going to yell at anybody if they go the other way. Garrett Wilson is 6K. That's if you're not going Breece Hall, I think having one exposure to a Jet is not necessarily a bad thing. Facing this Denver defense that is the worst in the NFL by a fairly wide margin is interesting. And then with no T. Higgins, I think if you're going to spend up this week, I'm going Jamar Chase. T. Higgins seems like he's out with a broken rib. Hasn't been confirmed, but those are 8 or 9 targets that are gonna be distributed elsewhere. And who else is going to catch the ball? Tyler Boyd? I'm not going there.
What do you got, Phil?
Yeah, Garrett Wilson is the reason that I wouldn't play Brees Hall in cash because I don't want 2 Jets, and I think he is the best, dollar per projected target play on this slate. And maybe Zach Wilson target should only count for like 75 cents on the dollar, but still, he's a high end talent. They force fed him last week, 14 targets against the Broncos. That defense is a joke. They've given up 29 DraftKings points to Jacoby Myers, 36 to Tyreek Hill, 30 to DJ Moore last week. And, if he's going to see double digit targets, 6K is a pretty low bar to clear for a guy with Garrett Wilson's talent. I want to get one of the high price guys into my cash lineup, either Tyreek Hill or Justin Jefferson, if I could help it. Right now in my placeholder lineup, I've got Hill because I do like stacking quarterbacks, and I am playing Tua at the moment. Gives it a little extra oomph. Um, I don't really need to go into why Tyreek Hill is a good play. The Giants might have been a neutral matchup against wide receivers this year, but I think a lot of that is game script where they've been getting blown out and teams don't have to pass against them. Miami's team total is just too good. I don't think it would surprise anyone if Hill was over 100 yards and a couple of touchdowns. And then Jefferson is also pretty obvious. He's Jefferson, and Minnesota's probably going to have to throw 50 times against Kansas City. The one guy in the mid range that I do like is Marquise Brown. He has quietly been like a picture of consistency. Um, 3x his current salary in each of the last three, averaging 9 targets per game over that span. The matchup is rough against the Bengals, but like I said, I do like that game. I am expecting a bounce back finally from the Cincinnati offense, and I think that points to Marquise Brown being okay at 5,000. I think he won't be the reason you lose in cash.
Hard pass.
Fair
No,
enough.
it's just I think Nico Collins or Tank Dell has more upside. I think it's I'd rather trust CJ Stroud than Josh Dobbs. But
I get that. Yeah, I had Dell highlighted as well. Zay Flowers was one at 5,500 going against that Steelers defense. Those corners have been exploitable. We're going to mention Zay Flowers every single show. So he's one. It does feel like, aren't we due for a Jalen Waddle get right game at
FanDuel
7,500?
at 6,800 is a ridiculous price.
Yeah. I kind of feel like we're due for that Jalen Waddle get right game. And then AJ Brown has dominated the past 2 weeks. Finally scored last week at 8,000. He's that entry point into those upper level wide receivers outside, going the opposite of that Stafford play. And so you're getting exposure both sides in that game. That's one that I've got my eye on as well. Anybody else?
Nope. Let's go.
All right, let's hit tight ends.
Is this just Sam Laporta and move on? Like, are we in alignment? 5K
Yeah.
is a ridiculous price.
I think he's
There's
tough
no
to
Kyle Pitts talk on this show.
No, I'm not going to say
God.
Kyle
I was
Pitts.
going to say Johnny over Kyle Pitts.
I think he's tough to fit though at 5K. I guess if you come down to Stafford, then it does do the trick, and I'll probably end up going that route before it's all said and done. But I think that Zach Ertz is also viable at 3,500. He's got a 25% target market share that leads all tight ends. He's not going to do anything with those targets except catch them and fall down, but that counts on DraftKings where it's full PPR. So if you are spending up at quarterback and you're not coming down to a Stafford and you're trying to get into like that 7K range, then I think Ertz makes sense. And maybe that's a good reason then not to play Marquise Brown, because having two Cardinals in your lineup is pretty much the same thing as having two Jets. You don't want to do that.
Yeah, and I think that people are going to hit Higbee off of the narrative on those Eagles, but I don't like that play. And so Higbee's one that I'm going to stay off, but I agree with Laporta. I mean, Mark Andrews is only 5,500 above Laporta, and so it's kind of in the similar ballpark. He got off a little bit last week with multiple touchdowns there, so that might be a pivot potentially as well, but I agree. I think it's Laporta and move on. All right. Make sure to head to footballguys.com/plans to become a Hall of Fame subscriber. Hall of Fame subscribers get access to all DFS content for less than $20 monthly or $95 annually. That's going to roll us into GPP plays. And Devin, are you going a different direction on quarterback on your GPP plays?
Yeah, I think, you sort of have to look at where the roster percentages are. And right now, Matthew Stafford is like 4%. So I think he's still very much in play for for GPPs. If that rises, like if he becomes a top 3 or 4 guy, then maybe you don't go that route. But this game is entirely stackable. Like you could go, Matthew Stafford, you could take a chance on Cooper Kupp. I probably wouldn't. I probably would go Matthew Stafford, and then the problem is both Puka and Cooper Kupp are both pricey, but you could go AJ Brown on the other side. I think that's completely fine. And Kyron Williams, he's getting all of the red zone looks, like whether it's targets or runs. He's getting everything. So I think Tyler Higbee leads. I can pull it up while we're talking, but the red zone snaps for this team, or red zone targets for this team, are crazy. If I look at the Rams, I have it open right now. Kyron Williams has 24 targets or carries in the red zone. No receiver has more than 3 targets for the rest of the team. That includes Atwell, Nakua, Higbee, etc. So all of the carries, all of the passes, 19 passes for Stafford, 8 of them have gone to Williams. They're throwing to him. So I think if you wanted to stack that way, you could. So other quarterbacks that I do like this week, I think going and spending up may not be the worst idea. And there's a couple guys. I do like Tua, but he's going to be the most popular guy in the slate. Patrick Mahomes hasn't really shown it. The matchup is good, but I think this is another Kirk Cousins game. 6,900. He's not going to be all that popular. He's somewhere in the 5 to 6% range as of Thursday night. We've seen just garbage time from Cousins week after week after week after week. We saw it against Philly where he threw for 340 and 4. It's a very stackable matchup at 6,900. You can go with Jefferson. You could probably fit Travis Kelce if you really wanted to. And I think that that's sort of a route that you could go. And then one off the radar, just take a stab, is CJ Stroud. The matchup isn't great, but Stroud has proved, I think, everyone wrong this season. And at 6K, no one's going to play him. He's going to be less than 2% rostered. So you could stack both, pick a receiver. You could pick Dell. You could pick Collins. I prefer Collins, like I said. You could probably take both, although I wouldn't. They haven't shown that they both can suffice in a lineup together this season. So I would probably pick one or run 2 lineups, both with one or the other.
Phil, what do you have?
I like Jalen Hurts better than any other quarterback. I agree with what Devin said about paying up. I think that tournaments are where you want to play your Hurtses, your Mahomes, your Tua stacks. Other than that, I agree with the call on Kirk Cousins, and I'll throw Joe Burrow out there. I've mentioned Cincinnati a bunch of times already. I mean, the Cardinals allowed 320 and 2 touchdowns to this year's version of Daniel Jones. I think they could manage to do the same to this year's version of Joe Burrow. He says that his mobility is improving and he feels as good as he's felt all season. So take that for what it's worth. Could be a good thing. And
haven't we heard that every week? Like he's just better and better and better, and like I feel great.
Well,
and
later in the week he feels better. Early in the week he
yeah,
can't move around,
it's like
so.
every week. Oh, I feel great, and I'm near 100%. Okay,
Well,
everybody in the NFL doesn't feel great on Mondays and feels better on Fridays. So
yeah, like
what he said this week was that he was feeling as good as he had coming off of a game. So I'm buying that.
I'm sure after he won a national championship, he's feeling better this week than after that national championship. Okay, Joe, we believe you.
Well, the real thing is that the Cardinals' front seven stinks. I'm not sure that they could pressure him, and he's really been starving for a clean pocket. And I think he gets it this week, and I think he looks a little bit more like the old Joe Burrow. And with Higgins out and those targets getting a little bit more concentrated, I think you could stack him up pretty good with a couple of receivers. Other than that, I don't think anybody's going to be on Lamar Jackson, and he's been playing pretty well lately. He doesn't really profile as a great play for me, but I'll probably throw a couple of lineups in just to try to leverage the low ownership.
We know that Tennessee Titans are exploitable against the air. Is Anthony Richardson, is it just going to be because they're too fierce on the ground for him to be a consideration, or is that somebody that might be undervalued that has the potential ceiling?
I think he might end up going under owned. I think it's the 7K. It's the 7K price sticker, right?
Sure.
That's kind of like the point where I think I had said it once before on this show that as soon as it hits 7K, that's where I'd start thinking twice about Richardson. And this week there is a little added uncertainty. You know, does Jonathan Taylor re-entering the lineup? Does that help him? Does it hurt him? I don't have the answer to that question, which means he might be a fine play in tournaments, but I could tell you that as far as like optimal lineups, he's really not coming anywhere near them right now. And he also doesn't profile as a particularly great tournament play. So as of right now, he's not in the plans, but I'm open to the counter argument.
Yeah, I mean, you're hoping for 2 rushing touchdowns at this point at 7K.
Yeah.
And could it happen? Sure. I think it could. But can we rely on that? If you wanted to take a stab at him, okay, fine. Because Tennessee, if I think about just game plans, Tennessee is very strong up the middle. Could they do some, fakes to Jonathan Taylor and he runs the ball off tackle? Sure. I think if you get in the red zone, you could use Taylor as a distraction. So, is it possible? Yeah, I think it's possible. But is it a guy that I'm going to be super excited to be playing at 7K? Probably not this week.
Yeah, I hear you. I get that.
Like
Let's
Tua
toss
is
out
$100 more. I mean,
no, and Cousins is $100 less on DraftKings, and I think
yeah.
it's hard to pass up Cousins for $100 less.
I think
Let's hope.
on FanDuel, and I'm just checking Richardson's price, he's
Yeah,
probably more tolerable just because there's not that 300-yard bonus. Although he is 8,300, that's
he's 8,300 on FanDuel.
rough.
So yeah, you're really buying in. You're really buying into his ability through the air, adding two rushing touchdowns, and people not playing him. But
Yeah.
all right, running backs. Is this where Devon Achane gets involved in your lineups here, Devin? Is that what you're thinking?
I think so, but we have to monitor his roster percentage because right now he's going to be somewhere between 20 and 25%.
Yeah.
That immediately tells me, is this Raheem Mostert? Like, do you pivot? Achane had 60% of the snaps last week. It was a blowout situation in which the Bills were controlling really from Jump Street. Is that going to be the trend where Achane is just going to be taking over this backfield? Maybe, maybe not. But I can't definitively say that yet. And Raheem Mostert had, what did he have last week? Only 7 carries for 9 yards. So could this be a complete replacement of Achane? I think Achane's fine, but you're going to have to get unique elsewhere. If you wanted to get off the wall, you could go with Mostert, who's going to be less than 10% rostered. One situation I'm really watching, and I should have mentioned this in cash, is the status of Javonte Williams. Because if Javonte Williams misses, Jaleel McLaughlin is interesting. He's cheap as all can be. I know that our Cecil Lammy, who's a beat reporter, I don't know if he would call himself that, but he's in the building with the Broncos nearly every day, at least during the offseason. 5K for McLaughlin. I know that he loved him coming into the season, so he's a guy that could be intriguing. And then if I just rattle off some names here just really quickly that I do like in GPPs that we might not have mentioned. I think Isaiah Pacheco, we did talk a little bit about him. Kyron Williams, we talked about the red zone volume that he is getting is going to be underlooked. Saquon Barkley, 8,100. Not a lot of people going to be looking his way. If a scenario breaks out, we've seen Miami have rushing issues where Austin Eckler ran all over them. Could they put Barkley in that role? Potentially. Health is always a concern with him. But, most of the roster percentages, we're looking at 8 guys: Swift, Mixon, Achane, Robinson, Montgomery, Kamara, Madison, Hall, that are all going to be somewhere between 17 and 24%. It's a really narrow bucket. So don't be afraid to play those guys, but just know that you should really try and diversify elsewhere.
Yep, I had the same exact note. Without CMC, without Tony Pollard, without Josh Jacobs, it's not like anybody's going to go too far past 20% at running back. So you can play the cash game guys that we mentioned, but there are some spots where you could definitely diversify. I think I kind of did this once the last time it projected as a David Montgomery game script. I went with Jameer Gibbs, and I think we've kind of reached the tipping point where people are no longer excited about playing one of the most exciting players in the league. So if he comes in around 5% or less, I like that. I mean, the Montgomery game script makes a lot of sense, and I'm playing it in cash. But if he doesn't plop into the end zone a couple of times, Gibbs is capable of outscoring him against that defense on one or two breakaway runs at like a quarter of the roster percentage. And outside of that, I had Brees Hall, but I think I've been talked out of it for GPPs. I mean, if Devin is on him in cash, I just can't see it. Then I think that quote
What does that
from
mean?
well, if you're
Evan
on him
likes
in
him in cash, so he's an absolute. We cannot play him. Thanks,
if
Phil.
here all right, here's what I meant. If you like him in cash, that means other people like him in cash. That means I thought he was going to come in around 10%, but that Robert Saleh quote probably boosted him like another 5 to 7. At which point he's a good GPP play in that he's high variance, but a high variance play at high ownership is not a good GPP play. So I think I've managed to talk myself out of Brees Hall in tournaments as I sit here tonight.
I have him as the 8th highest rostered running back, somewhere in the 13 to 15 range.
One
But
that
that's what I mean. There's a lot of guys that are going to be that 13, 15, up to 20 this week.
we've still seen Alexander Madison be the primary back for the Vikings, and that's accessibility into that Vikings Chief game if that turns into a shootout. That's one that I think might be well under the radar because I think people kind of expect Cam Akers to eventually take over that. But at 5,700, I think that opens up some things in other directions as well.
Is Derrick Henry back?
Yeah,
He's back.
I think so.
All right. If he's back, he's a good play in tournaments.
Like he's back. Like Derrick Henry's back.
Oh, you're just saying back in general. Like, is he
Yeah.
going to be the Derrick Henry of old?
JD's back.
Is he going to look like he did last week? Because he looked pretty good.
Certainly could. I mean, he faced the Browns in 2 weeks ago, and no one has been able to run against Cleveland. So,
Right.
Let's discount that a little bit. He's still at 80 yards and a touchdown rushing against the Chargers, and the Chargers have been better against the run than they were the past couple of seasons. And he's been catching the ball a little bit here and there. So, he's gotten a bad rap. I think a lot of people saw the Cleveland game and sort of just wrote him off, but I think he's fine. He's more than fine.
All right, let's hit wide receivers. Phil, what are you looking for with wide receivers and GPPs?
I like Amon-Ra St. Brown with the big old caveat that he needs to practice tomorrow. He's missed both practices to begin the week, but said that his goal is to play. I thought he looked good last week against Green Bay, even though he wasn't needed all that much. The 16.6 DraftKings points he scored last week were actually his worst outing of the season. I think that people who are going to spend in that range at wide receiver are more likely to look at Chase, A.J. Brown, and the injury should limit his ownership, and that makes him a good leverage play on Montgomery, who I think is going to be pretty chalky. And who knows, maybe the return of Jameson Williams opens things up a little bit more for him underneath. Outside of that, give me Jamar Chase and Tyler Boyd to go with Burrow, with T. Higgins out. And I like the idea of Devontae Smith this week. Philly and Cincinnati are my two favorite stacks, as I mentioned, and Smith is simply a leverage play. I don't see him as 2 to 2.5 times less likely to have a blow up game in this spot than AJ Brown, and that's what the roster percentages imply at the moment. So I think that's a good way to go in tournaments.
Devin, you got anybody else?
Yeah, I think there's a couple guys. I think stacking, whether it's Jamar Chase or Tyler Boyd, and we'll get into stacks with Joe Burrow. I know I was poo-pooing on Burrow a little bit, but this Arizona defense they're allowing the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this year, and they faced Sam Howell, Daniel Jones, Dak Prescott, and Brock Purdy. So they haven't really faced a gauntlet of receivers. If I think about, I do like Matthew Stafford quite a bit, and Zach Wilson, I think is a good. What am I doing? What am I? I swear I had COVID like a month ago and my brain still can't think. I'm talking about quarterbacks in a wide receiver section. What am I doing? Okay, let's talk
Zach
about
Wilson
receivers.
hasn't accepted you.
Zach Wilson can't catch passes. Let's talk about receivers. Garrett Wilson, Jamar Chase, those are the guys I want. And those are the guys that you're going to stack with those quarterbacks that I otherwise just, my brain is mush. DeAndre Hopkins against Indianapolis. Indianapolis secondary, they are down quite a few guys. I can pull up the names, but I don't want to even do another thing to distract myself. And rotating Daryl Baker in, who's one of the worst corners in football. And Hopkins has been like their only receiver this season. So he's a guy that certainly hasn't had that explosive game yet, but it's coming. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 7,800. Definitely interesting against Carolina. With no J.C. Horn, Carolina's secondary has been somewhat vulnerable, particularly to wide receivers. If I think about, Justin Jefferson had 85 yards and 2 touchdowns. DK Metcalf had over 100 yards. Chris Olave had 86 yards. So they've really struggled against number one receivers. Amon-Ra could get it done this week. I did talk about Sam Laporta, but we'll get to tight ends, and he's probably a fade this week in GPPs just because I think he will be extremely popular. And then, I would say any 3K guy that you think has a role besides Wan'Dale Robinson, because Wan'Dale Robinson is going to be 25 to 30% rostered. And, any of these guys we talked about could break, one long catch could theoretically, whether it's Calvin Austin or Josh Downs or who was the other name that I mentioned earlier?
Rashee Rice.
Rashee Rice. That's right.
Really
Thank you. And then Josh Reynolds is the last name I'll throw out there. He's been good. I know Jameson Williams comes back, but is Jameson Williams really going to have a role? Josh Reynolds is a guy who no one's going to play him because no one ever plays him. And he's been better than people think. So I do like both of the receivers in Detroit. And that's it.
We saw Alan Lazard get off for a touchdown last week, and if Patrick Surtain is on Garrett Wilson, that's another 3,900 play that may be in that going against that Broncos defense. The only other one that I was really looking at was maybe Michael Pittman Jr. against that Titans defense that we know is exploitable through the air. That's the way you want to attack them. I don't have anything else to add in wide receivers, but let's bounce through tight ends real quick. Phil, who are you looking for at GPP and tight ends? You're muted, bud.
Thank you. I want as much Travis Kelce as I could possibly get. And outside of that, my other tight end for GPPs is Dallas Goedert at 4,200. He's $800 cheaper than his week one price to open the season. He hasn't hit yet, but I'm going to chalk that up to variance and say that he's due. He's out there. He's 92% of the routes this season. He's got a target share over 20% in half his games. And he's too talented not to post a big number with that usage. And there's kind of a squeaky wheel narrative with him this week. We'll see how that works out. But I mentioned that I'll just give away my favorite stack, and you could skip me in that segment. It's Hurts, Devontae Smith, and Dallas Goedert. And obviously you could play around with that, right? Get some lineups too with A.J. Brown and Goddard. But I'm really into the Hurts double stack for tournaments, and Goddard is going to be a mainstay there.
Should I talk about quarterbacks again and just completely?
Devin, any other quarterbacks we haven't mentioned yet?
I can't believe that. I'm talking and I'm like, this isn't right, but I just kept talking. Anyway,
it was like when Ron Burgundy is reading the teleprompter.
Yeah, it was like I was looking at something and I'm just like, what are these words that are coming out of my mouth? Because they don't make sense. Wow. Anyway, I think Mark Andrews is really interesting. I think, Jeff, you talked about him going up against Pittsburgh. No one is really going to roster him because a lot of people are going to be looking to Sam Laporta or Dallas Goedert in that price range. And then if I wanted to go down and just, take a cheap guy, I think Chig Okonkwo is a guy who's interesting. I think Tennessee throws the ball against Indianapolis. I think Tennessee wins this game and has a pretty good performance. They've had really been an up down. They've been an up and down team this year, but they figured some things out last week, and they looked incredibly impressive against the Bengals. So I think that's a team that I'm looking at.
All right. The only other ones, Jonnu Smith. I mean, it's hard to ignore what Atlanta is doing with that particular tight end in relation to the other tight end that we want things to happen with. And then Tyler Conklin, I talk about going against the Broncos defense. That might be another accessibility point on against that Broncos defense in GPP plays. All right, time to bounce through our favorite stacks. And I know we got Phil's favorite stacks running with the Philly stack. Devin, what's your favorite stack?
Yeah, it's Kirk Cousins, Justin Jefferson, and you could run it back if you can fit Travis Kelce. Do it. If not, go down to Rashee Rice and just punt the position and hope for the best. But I think that Cousins has we saw Zach Wilson have a good game against Kansas City. Like, come on, Cousins can't have a good game here. So that's the one that I'm looking at. And then Jared Goff, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Adam Thielen is sort of my under the radar stack against Carolina.
Yeah, and I like to play the Dolphins get right stack on Tua Tagovailoa, Raheem Mostert, and Jalen Waddle. You kind of going against the grain on people playing Achane and Tyreek Hill there, but kind of a get right spot to get some of those guys rolling against the Giants defense. That's very, very exploitable. Last thing that we've got is discount plays. And Phil, who is your discount play?
It's hard not to say Wan'Dale Robinson at the bare minimum. So I'm just going to take the low hanging fruit.
Matthew Stafford for me. All aboard. Choo choo.
We'll go. You guys are taking the words out of my mouth here. I'll go with Zay Flowers in that mid range, but I think that's a great point against exploitable Steelers cornerbacks. That's all we've got for you tonight, and hopefully good luck this week. Guys, you got any parting words for anybody?
No, I mean, let's enjoy week 5. Like, I can't believe we're already a month and a half into the season.
I know.
It flies by, and these are the weeks where we really start to think we know things about teams, and then all of a sudden curveballs happen and the NFL is scripted. So, those writers are back from their strike. So expect some weird things this week.
Good stuff. Make sure to like and subscribe.
I'm serious about like this whole thing. That's funny.